Good morning and welcome back to the Living Uncompromised podcast. Good morning, Jen.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm
I'm
excited to
excited
dig in.
excited to dig into lesson 4, starting in Judges 14. We're going to dive into the first 14 verses there, and I think that there is a lot to dive into.
There is. We're seeing like the beginning of Samson's part of the story as far as his accountability, him going and doing the things God's called him to do. And so, yeah, there's a lot going on. Just time is kind of skipped. And so now Samson is grown. And so we are jumping right in to what the Lord is calling him to do.
That's right. Well, and let's go ahead and do that. So, we begin chapter 14 that they went down to Timnah and he sees one of the daughters and he says, "This is who I want to marry."
Yes, he sees this young woman who is a Philistine woman. So that's important because remember, they're under the rule of the Philistines at this time. God's people were. And so this was somebody outside of who God had told his people that they could connect with, that they could marry, and things like that. So that's an important piece right there.
I agree with that. And I also think it's important to note that they went down wherever that was, but they were not living amongst each other. So she would have possibly been the first time he's seen her. We don't know that, but we do know that this is all based on a physical attraction.
Yes, and that's going to become apparent later on in our reading. But yes, what he sees in that moment is definitely physically related. And we are going to find out, obviously, in the next couple verses, that it is from the Lord. But this is a physical attraction that he's having. He's going to talk to her later and decide he did like her. But what he's feeling right now is from simply seeing her because God has put that particular desire in his heart for this girl.
That's right. And I think, as we look into the next verses, he sees her, but then he does go to his parents and he says in verse 2, "Now get her for me as my wife." And so I think for me, there's a lot to dive into in this one little section because his parents are obviously going to have an opinion about him marrying a Philistine daughter, and that is not going to be a favorable decision on their part. But I think it's important to note that the Lord had put this on Samson, and we can dive into that a little bit. I like to take a side view of it and think as parents, we have to understand that the Lord may be doing something in our children's lives or in the lives of others that we are not directly involved with. They did have a role and they've raised Samson. Now Samson has his own walk with the Lord and them trusting, his decisions. I do think it's important to note they tried to guide him and give him guidance. And he did have enough respect for them to go and talk to them about this. And so they obviously were a family unit and he respected their opinion. But I think there's just a lot to kind of sort through in these few little verses here.
Yeah, I think they it would have been right on their part to say, "Wouldn't you want somebody from our people?" And they call her the uncircumcised Philistines is what they call them, because that circumcision was their covenant with God. And so this was what that meant was these Philistines were not part of their people, God's people. And they were forbidden to marry those in the nation that they went in, the promised land. They were not to intermarry with these other nations because they would have led God's people astray. That was God's protection for them so that they would not be led astray. So they were right in saying, why this girl? Wouldn't you prefer somebody more like one of our own, one of God's people? But to your point, they didn't understand that God was doing something there. And that's the difference, right? Samson's at an age where the Lord is directing him one way and his parents are trying to guide him, but the Lord is doing something else and he is being pulled in that direction.
Well, and he stands on that at the end of verse 3, and he says, "Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes." So, and obviously they honored that because we go right into 4 where it says, that was where it talks about that the parents didn't know that that was from the Lord. But then down in 5, then Samson went with his mom and dad down there to get her. So obviously there became an agreement. They respected his decision and they were following through to try to help him do that.
Yes, and it would have been, right for them to go down there and start the customary proceedings, and the feast and said all that as we're gonna see. And so, yeah, they do go down there with him to work this out and make this make this wedding happen for him.
Right, by following the honorary customs and traditions and doing it the appropriate way.
Right.
But as we see him going, this is where the roaring lion enters the scene. So let's
Yes.
dive into that a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to read just a couple verses quickly. And then I want to dig into it just a minute, but it says, as they approached the vineyards of Timnah, suddenly a young lion came roaring toward them. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as he might have torn a young goat. Several things. The first thing is when it says a young lion came roaring toward him, it makes me think of the verse that talks about our enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion. And so you get this picture of the enemy, right? And then he's given the strength. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon him in power so that he could tear this lion apart. And so I found this quote. It's from Matthew Henry's commentary. And I just thought it was a really good word about this particular incident. And he says this. It's a little bit long, but I think it's worth noting. He says, God let Samson know what he could do in the strength of the Spirit of the Lord, that he might never be afraid to look the greatest difficulties in the face. And then he makes a comparison to David. He says, David, who was to complete the destruction of the Philistines, as we know, David went up against Goliath, the Philistine. David must try his hand first upon a lion and a bear, that hence he might infer, as we may suppose Samson did, that the uncircumcised Philistine should be as one of them. And I just thought that was a really good description of what was going on here. The Lord was giving him this victory over this enemy so that he could understand he was going to be empowered to take on the enemy, the Philistines. And this would have been a moment of confidence and strength for him, that look what you can do through the power of the Lord. You could tear this animal with your bare hands. And that was foreshadowing of what God was going to do and how God was going to use Samson against the Philistines.
I think that's a great word, and I'm glad that we're diving into it, because when you think about all that's going on with this lion and this, what would be an enemy attack type of reference, we also see that he had separated from his parents. So he was battling this while he was alone, and he had separated himself enough that, it doesn't note that somebody ran to help him, anything. He was alone. And this was an encounter he had while he was by himself.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because I think this was for him, right? This was the strength and encouragement that he needed to do what God called him to do. We talked about that, right? Why the angel of the Lord came to Samson's mother and not Manoah, his father. There was purpose in that. God had a calling on her life. This is Samson's moment for the Lord to show him that in his strength, Samson could do what God called him to do. It wasn't for anybody else. And I think about, as Matthew Henry was talking about, I think about David out as a shepherd boy. He was taking on lions and bears out there, in the fields, and that was training him up for what God would call him to do. He would take on Goliath, the Philistine. He would also lead, the Israelites, but God was preparing him out there in the fields. And here God is preparing Samson alone in the vineyard for what God's calling him to do.
Yes, I love that. And I think if we try to make an application for ourselves through all of this, I think it's important to note that you do have to separate yourself from everybody at times, and you do have to go and be alone, and so that the Lord can reveal things to you in private that he cannot reveal to you when you are, surrounded or distracted or other things. That it is very important to have alone time, because sometimes the Lord will reveal the sweetest and, the sweetest things in his plan for you, and just to give you an encouragement and guidance and all the things that we see him do with Samson through this encounter. We can also experience some things from the Lord when we allow ourselves to separate and be alone with him.
Right. And also those are the moments where we see that we are wholly dependent on the Lord and not on anybody else. There's nobody else there. So if the Lord did not strengthen him to take on this lion, what would have become of him? And so it's those moments where the Lord is teaching us that he is what we need. He's all that we need. And he He will give us what we need in those moments.
That's great. That's great. I love that. And I think as we're going to come back to the lion situation here in a minute, but, we see in the meantime that they continue to go down and start talking and preparing, for the wedding. And then in verse 8, we see after some days he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion and honey. He scraped it out into his hands and went on, eating as he went, and he gave some to his father and mother, and they ate. And so I think, as we continue this conversation, just the second part of this lion situation, some time has passed. Well, enough time has passed that it's just the carcass, and a
Yes.
beehive has had time to to settle in there, and there's honey.
Right. Yeah, I think, just digging into this a little bit, he turns aside and he goes again to see what has happened, and I think there was probably encouragement there for him to see, what God had done. I there's a couple ways I think we could look at it. I think turning aside, we have to be careful. I think we turn aside and we visit what God has done. That is important, right? Because it reminds us how God has been so faithful and has given us victory. He needed a reminder of that victory as he was getting ready to go back into Timnah. So he was returning into Philistine territory. He needed that reminder of God's faithfulness and God's power upon him. I think we have to be careful because we can become caught up in our own conquest, and it's important that we remember that God has given us those victories. But I think, if we could just dig into the honey for just a second, I think, he fights these, well, it doesn't say he fights these bees, but we can assume that he has to, navigate these swarm of bees that are there to scoop out this sweet honey. And I think it's a reminder that God is going before him as he goes into Timnah. It's this strength for the battle, perhaps. I think it reminds me of, and I'll tell you why I say that, and you can tell me what you think. There's a passage in Samuel, First Samuel, and it's about honey, where Saul had commanded the army nobody could eat until he said, nobody can eat. He bound the people to an oath until I've avenged myself on my enemies. And so, um, 1 Samuel 14:25 says, the entire army entered the woods and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. But Jonathan, who was Saul's son, had not heard that his father had bound these people with the oath. So he reached out the end of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised it to his mouth and his eyes brightened. And it was this encouragement that was needed for these soldiers, for this army. And so I just think about that too, that there was encouragement in this honey for him to go back in against the Philistines, to be able to navigate the bees to get the honey, to the sweetness to go back in and do what God had called him to do.
I think that's a great point. And I think, when you initially think of honey, you would think of something as sweet and as good. And, and you wouldn't think of it and turn away, and, you wouldn't want that. You would want it, and it would be something that would be appealing. Obviously, there was a swarm of bees, and he took it and he shared it with his parents. And so I think that's a great point, and definitely something to think on, and the purpose of it.
Yes, I do think the fact that he did not tell his parents, I do think that perhaps had to do with with the law that God had given, not the Nazarite law, but the law God had given to the Israelites, that they were not to touch the carcass of an animal. They would be unclean. And so I think likely that's why he did not tell his parents where it came from. I think what you said earlier, this was his personal journey that he was on, and the Lord was doing this for him. But I also think this would have maybe made them unwilling to participate in it, because they would have been unclean. And
And
so anyway, I just
it would have also led to him having to explain more of the story too, right? He
yeah,
didn't tell anybody about this lion and this whole encounter. He has kept that to himself. So at
yeah.
this point, his parents don't even know about that. So that would lead maybe to questions and him having to say more. I do think your point about it would have made them unclean it's has got to be a factor for sure. But I do think it's important to remember that this whole thing was private. He didn't boast about it to anybody else. He didn't share about it with anybody else until we start looking at his riddle later. But at this point, this has just been something that he has kept to himself.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Which I think is going to be important as we get into the riddle piece and as we get into, his new wife and her part in all this. Nobody knows this. Nobody knows this journey that he's been on with the Lord, kind of on this side journey that he's been on as he's walking with his parents. And that's important because it's going to be a factor when people find out the answer to the riddle. And knowing that his parents and no one has been told is an important piece of information also.
So now let's work into the new section, this next section about the riddle and about them heading down to start the feast and this 7-day period and all of that.
Yeah, so they go down to do these festivities, and so his parents begin to set up this feast, and they appoint him 30 companions as part of these wedding festivities.
Yes, and I think it's important, you know, we look in verse 11. I just like to note this because it says, as soon as the people saw him, they brought him 30 companions. So whether it's tradition or not, they are noting something about him physically when they saw him. That kind of sticks with me a little bit. But
Yes, and they were receiving him, right? Like, I mean, he's not of them either. He's not a Philistine. They're receiving him into this situation, into this wedding feast, and to to do this. They're accepting that.
and then we
And so
move
then
into the riddle
go ahead.
part. Yeah, go ahead.
No, so I'm going the same place you are, which is the riddle part. And so he says, let me tell you a riddle. He gives them 7 days to answer, the 7 days of the feast. And so I think that's important to note that. And so he gives them this riddle, which we know, well, the terms of the riddle. Let's do that first. So he says, I'll give you 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes if you win. But if you can't answer me, then you do the same. You give me 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. And so he enters this agreement and they're good with it. They say, tell us the riddle. And so we know immediately, those of us who have the backstory, right? We know immediately where this is coming from. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. And so we know that's personal to his experience that he's just had with the lion. It's almost like he's going in to begin this deliverance of the Philistines. And it's like he has this secret. God has revealed this power to him. And so he's got this secret almost that he's banking the fact that they cannot figure out because nobody knows what's happened.
Right. And why would this be their guess? Right. So there's got to
Yeah.
be some type of confidence in him alone to say, I
Yeah.
know something you don't, and I'm
Yeah.
going to win this bet and get these things from you. Because why would that be their first guess? That was a private experience that up to this point, no one knows about. And
Right.
so why would they even think that he had the power to destroy a lion like this? Like, it's a private thing. I think it's really good to the confidence he had in making a bet. Because, I mean, if you're going to make a bet or something with someone, don't you do it with a certain level of confidence that you might win? I mean, just
Yeah.
on a general note.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I feel like he knew this was in the bank, right, for him, I'm sure.
Think it's significant. We can talk about the 7 days. And so, we end this section of lessons for this week and they're 3 days in. And well, obviously they're starting to appear a little bit desperate in trying to solve the riddle, and they haven't given up on it. And they're very
Right.
determined to try. We
Right.
will see next week to get the answer to it. But
Mhm.
we're not very far into it, and they obviously are not even headed in any direction of solving it.
Yeah. Yeah, 3 days and they don't have a clue because we're gonna find out with our next section of reading immediately, they're gonna start trying to do a workaround, to kind of cheat the system a little bit to figure this out because they don't know, and they wouldn't know because nobody knows, and so yeah, they can't figure it out, and I'm sure Samson was pretty confident in himself at this time.
Well, and I look forward to diving in next week because we're going to pick up into, equally challenging scripture as far as just dissecting the story and the direction and all the little pieces and details that are in it. So I look forward to picking up there because we're going to pick up on day 4 of this riddle next week. So, but I think today's discussion was great and I enjoyed it. And I just really enjoy diving into the details because I think the details matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it brings the scripture to life when we see there's so much to it and so many important components. And so stopping and digging into those makes such a difference in how we understand God's word. So I'm glad to be able to do that.
Yes. Well, we hope everyone is enjoying the study, and we look forward to next week diving into lesson 5. And so,
Yes.
yes, so everyone have a good week of study, and we will chat then.
Yes. Have a great week.